We have on the far right, Eric Johnson, Executive Director of the Washington Association of Counties, and it's been a lot of other things in his life. I first met him when he was on the Forest Practice Board, long time ago. Ben Serr in the middle, from the Department of Commerce from Spokane area, and he got his introduction to the Forest Practice Board about a year ago, I think. And Peter Goldman from the Washington Law Center. Most everybody, I think, probably knows him. And we are missing Patrick Capper. He hurt his back real bad this morning. Couldn't walk, couldn't hardly even get out of bed, I guess. So we're going to go along and see what we've got on the schedule here. So West Side small forest landowners harvest about the same volumes per acre as industry, but about half of the size of the harvest unit. But East Side small forest landowners harvest much less on average because they generally do periodic thinning rather than regeneration harvest. And I think I mentioned our harvest units on the west side typically are about half the size of industry harvest units. Small landowners don't have the same economies of scale as industry. We tend to either under or over manage. We harvest when we need money rather than the optimal harvest ages. Our harvests are smaller, which affects our costs and our returns. We do a lot of stuff ourselves, but we are often penny wise and pound foolish. We are blessed with very low current use property taxes, and I don't know if you can all see, probably can't all see this, but this is a list of a bunch of states. Washington's here. This shows our property tax. So looking at the blue lines, we're pretty competitive. We're really blessed with the low property taxes in our state. Current use taxation to try to intentionally conserve ag, rural lands, forestry lands. But our timber harvest taxes are quite high relative to the rest of the country. And some few more facts and figures here. Forestry and logging, 5,000 jobs, good paying, high paying jobs. When you add what they call the indirect and the induced jobs, whatever all that means, the economists count that up. 5,000 jobs will actually translate into 7,500 jobs. More interesting, if you go down the chain of people that take our logs and do things with our logs, and you add all of those direct jobs up, you come up with 40,000 jobs. If you do the same thing about the indirect and induced jobs, you can get that all the way up to 100,000 jobs, all from our 5,000 jobs up here. It's pretty cool. And if you translate that to dollars, the direct jobs, direct payments to job holders is, well, not all, the taxes get some of that, but $2 billion. If you look at the indirect and induced wages, it's $5 billion. That's $5 billion from our industry. And one figure that's not on this chart is looking at revenue. All this economic activity also creates about $28 billion per year in total revenue. So we are a significant economic driver for the state of Washington. This map just shows the jobs by county that are directly involved with forestry or logging, and the darker green are the counties that are more heavily forested. We may refer back to that. Talked at the earlier panel about social license. We're going to hit that maybe a little harder here in this panel. Small forest landowners share a common bond within our own community, but we are providing multiple public benefits to the economy, viewscapes, water, air, and critters alike. We are confident that any potential impacts from our management, small ways, are minimal and short-lived. We hear that the public supports forest management, at least until we get the chainsaws out for our once or twice century regeneration harvest, assuming a 50-year rotation. Small forest landowners are sustained in the short run by lots of other non-economic benefits, primarily including a labor of love for the land and the timber in our care, and you saw several examples of that during the luncheon program. I don't personally believe that anyone intentionally disrespects or doesn't appreciate what we do, but I also know that as a group of wonderful and well-deserving folks that we do feel disrespected and unappreciated. Why do we feel twinges of guilt when we harvest? So, again, I think I've already introduced our panel members. So I've got one general question, and I think we've got enough time. We'll probably get through all the questions this time. So, but looking at the parties up there, at least one in particular, I'm probably going to lose control here real quick. But who knows? He's also been to our tree farm a couple of times, and he's an okay guy sometimes. I'm starting to relax. I'm seeing I'm getting through this, so I might go too far. Question for all of you. Other than because you were invited, please share some of your personal experience or motivation that gives you an interest in the well-being of small forest landowners. So whoever's got the mic, I think Ben, you got stuck with it.
Looks like it. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. So for me, part of it is the economic perspective. And so my job, I work for the Department of Commerce. I'm in the Growth Management Services Unit.
Hold. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So I work at Department of Commerce in the Growth Management Services Unit. And so we do, we're mostly working with counties and cities and towns around land use planning and the requirements around that. But part of land use planning is the economics. And so I think the numbers that you were showing there can speak loudly as to, why small forest landowners are important. They're important to communities because it generates income. Specifically, it generates income for rural communities in Washington, which I think is really important. Part of my day job at Commerce is I've got a specialty in resource lands designation, and so forest resource lands are part of that. There's 3 different types of resource lands, and so that is something that I have to work with day in and day out, and questions come to me, and so it's important for me to understand what small forest landowners are going through, what types of considerations counties and decision makers need to consider when they're setting up policies. And then on a personal note, my parents are small forest landowners in Stevens County. So I spent some time on their land. They've got about 100 acres. I would say about 30 of it is in forest land. And they have thinned it in the past 10 years. So when you were showing your picture of East Side, they're definitely represented by those who have thinned their land in the last few years. And come to think of it, all the property owners around them have thinned their land in the last 10 years.
Did they get you to actually do any of the work?
Well, I let the forester in and out of the gates. And I did do a little bit of replanting afterwards, so yeah. But, having that land in the family and, going out there with my kids, planting trees, it creates a sense of stewardship for the land, which I appreciate.
Good. Thank you.
I'm Eric Johnson. I'm Executive Director for the Washington State Association of Counties. And, I have an interesting perspective on why SFLOs are important. When I was in high school, I actually attended a Weyerhaeuser forestry management intern program. And During that, this was in the late 70s, and during that period of time, it dawned on me that I would rather help people enjoy trees than cut them down. So I entered the Parks and Recreation program, and so I spent 20 years in city, county, and state park administration.
So a tree hugger, huh?
Well, let me finish my story. So,
That's what I thought I was getting.
yeah. So what interestingly happened along the way is after living in Lewis County for about 20 years, I decided I was going to run for county commissioner, or thought I was going to run for county commissioner. And I was given a list of folks that I should talk to. And so I met Steve Stinson, and I'm not positive where. It was either at La Tarasca, for those of you that know Lewis County. It was either La Tarasca in Centralia. I think it was at Ole Club drinking beer, actually, which was what I did often when I was running for county commissioner. I started hearing about small forest landowners, and he started talking to me aggressively and assertively about a small forest landowner habitat conservation plan. And some of you that have been around a while know what I'm talking about. And I, it got under my skin. It got in my blood. I drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and it became very, very important to me. And I probably never missed a small forest landowner meeting in Lewis County the entire time I was a county commissioner. It was that important to me. We ultimately sponsored a now defunct plan that never took off as a county, small forest landowner HCP. They convinced me, and I was able to convince my partners that this was a good idea, that we needed to keep small forest landowners, not just from an economic perspective, but from a cultural perspective. It was the culture of our community, and how do we make sure that that happened? And so I got very, very involved. I left the county almost 13, 14 years ago now, so it's been a while, and have since come to the Association of Counties. You saw the map, timber, forest lands. It is significantly important to a vast number of our counties, and we'll talk more about why that is financially, how those taxes and where those taxes go for, and why that matters to county government. But there's in a nutshell why I think it's important to me personally, what motivates me still.
I guess we'll have to hand a mic on down to the guy writing on the legal pad there, but
I'm holding it up. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Goldman, and I'm the director of the Washington Forest Law Center, which I started back in '97.
Hold the microphone close.
Oh, sure. So I feel a little bit like the pig at the barbecue who showed up and said, "What's for dinner?" So there's a little bit of that, and I will not be offended if instead of the honey, you give me the bees at the end of this.
Anybody got
So
any bees?
one of the points that Ken asked us to address is, what's it going to take? This is his words. What's it going to take for you city folks to love small forest landowners? What's the social? What do we need to do? What aren't we doing? And what do we need to do better? And what aren't we doing? Well, first of all, honestly, environmentalists and small forest landowners have a lot in common. I think we all know that. We love forests, we're passionate about them, and we're passionate about them staying in forests. We are great volunteers, and we work for nothing. We're stubborn as hell, we know that, and we give DNR a lot of grief. So those are the four things that we definitely all have in common, and I'd say those are pretty big things. We are the kind of people where folks say, we are glad we had you as ancestors. And that's the most important message, is that we are passing down our world to the next generation, and we want to leave it a little bit better than we found it and make sure we don't do anything that harms it. But ultimately, Ken asked me to say, what's going to get you to care about us, to sustain us, to find the, what can we do? Why is it that we're always fighting? What do we need to get the social license, is the word you used. And social license is a good word. I'd like to reframe the question a little bit. Oh, excuse me, Ken also said, what is it that interests city folks about our land? What is it that interests you
Jumping
about
ahead
your
the
land?
agenda a little bit.
Oh, okay. You want me to just hold that
Yeah,
thought?
I'll
All
get
right.
to that one. So-
All right, I'll hold that thought for now, and then we'll move on to
Okay.
when we get to the
Don't want
questions.
you to
Okay.
shoot all your bullets all over.
All right, I won't. All right, that's enough for right now then.
Okay.
Well, and Ben, we'll give Ben another shot here, a special question for Ben, and you may have already touched on parts of it, so if you want to pass, that's okay too. But the question was, as a representative of the Department of Commerce, can you give the audience some economic perspective of how the forest products industry stacks up relative to the other economic engines in Washington? You have the experience in land use planning. Any thoughts regarding our pressures to sell and convert, economically viable ways to deal with development rights, maybe something about community forest, any of that ring in your mind is something that you might share with the group?
Sure, Ken. So I wanted to throw out a few numbers here regarding economics. And so forest products are the third largest manufacturing sector in the state when you add in paper and pulp and other value-added products. And so that's not insignificant, you know.
What's 1 and 2?
I knew you were going to ask that. And
Boeing's probably
I'm
one of
guessing
them.
airplanes is right up there, and you know, it wouldn't surprise me if Microsoft or something like that creeps in there. In 2017, Washington exported 22% of all the wood products in the U.S., and so that's pretty big for almost a quarter of all the wood products that are being sent out to other countries are coming through Washington State. Private land accounts for the vast majority of timber harvested, and I'm sure that people in this room already know that, but just for perspective, in 2017, 75% of board feet that were harvested came from private land in western Washington, and it was 70% in eastern Washington. And so, you know, it's the landowners, it's you guys who are producing this wood. And then I touched on this a little bit before, but I just wanted to reiterate that forestry is especially important for rural Washington. You know, you've got big economic drivers in the Puget Sound and other regions, but you know, when you're in Stevens County or Pend Oreille County or Grays Harbor County, the forestry sector is really important to the economy of those places.
And I think that's going to pick up with the Department of Natural Resources focus on forest health and some partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service. So if we get that infrastructure going in the east side, we'll really have accomplished something.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of land use and conversion of lands, so it depends on where you're at in the state, because there's development pressures and different development pressures depending on where you're at. So if you're in the Puget Sound, there's quite a bit of development pressure, whereas, you know, if you're in Pend Oreille County, there might be quite a bit less development pressure. And there are different approaches to preserving forest land depending on what kind of pressures are being experienced. So, you know, day to day I'm working with Growth Management Act stuff. So I gotta bring up the Growth Management Act. So the GMA requires that all counties in the state designate resource lands, and that includes forest lands. And the reason why this was included in the Growth Management Act is that enough land could be held in that use in order to make the economy function. So the industry was the important reason, whether it be agriculture or forest. You need to have enough forest or enough ag land in order to support an industry. And so that is why the Growth Management Act dictates to the counties that you have to go out and take a look at your lands and figure out what should be kept in forest and what should be kept in ag, what should be set aside for mineral lands. Because it's really important to the state of Washington to, maintain these resources long into the future. And then in terms of methods for trying to preserve that land, outside of resource land designation, so it's pretty tough to pull land out of resource land designation once it's put in. It's not impossible, but it's not an easy process.
Yeah, I think in Thurston County, it's 10, maybe it's statewide, 10 years of back taxes plus interest or something, I think, to pull it out of current use taxation.
Right, and so, yeah, so there's tools like you mentioned, Ken, tax deferral or a reduction in your taxes to maintain it in those lands and then having to pay those taxes back if you pull it out. Other tools are transfer of development rights. And so what that is areas where they've decided that there's lands that ought to be preserved, but they're not necessarily designated as a resource land. Say it's just a general rural land designation, and they could do a bunch of different things with it, but they've got, forests on it, for example. And there's development pressures in other places. You can sell the rights to develop your land. So if you got 160 acres and you can divide it up into 5-acre parcels, you could potentially take all that development that could occur from that, put it into a bank, and then somebody in a city can purchase those credits in order to build more than they normally would be allowed to build. And so that's one tool that's available in some places, but it's not available everywhere, and it varies county by county. So for example, Thurston County, I looked into it after I went out to Ken's place, and Thurston County, while they do have a transfer of development rights program in the county, it doesn't extend to forest land. It's only for ag land. And most of the other ones, King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap are all in kind of one group, and they do both forest and ag. And then other parts of the state, it depends. Clallam had a special ag designation in around Sequim, and then around Port Angeles they could do forest land there. So like I said, it varies from state to state. It's not or county to county, I should say. It's not uniform, and not all counties have it. The other thing that's critical about transfer of development rights is you really need a place to transfer those rights to. So if there isn't a lot of development pressure, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to have a program. And so in those other places, it comes back to taxing incentives and zoning, large lot zoning. So that's another tool that policymakers can use in order to preserve forest lands. And so you prevent the land from being chopped up into little tiny pieces, because once you do that, it really makes it hard to make it useful for resource lands.
Okay. Question for Eric. I'll give you the long-winded version here. And I'd kind of set him up a little bit with that one slide about taxes. Every time we look at trying to reduce our relatively high harvest taxes, we remind ourselves that the counties are where we live, where we grow our crops, and where we obtain our services. 95% of the 5% excise tax goes to county taxing districts. So Eric, can you give your audience any further idea of the level of taxes and employment forestry brings to the well-being of forested counties? Development restrictions from the Growth Management Act have created what kinds of problems or what kind of benefits to the counties? Can you talk about the rural-urban divide? Is there a similarity in the divide between mostly rural counties and mostly urban counties? How are the forested viewscapes important to the economic health of the counties there? That was quite a mouthful, so hopefully there's some food for thought there.
So it's a good government official. As soon as she said taxes, I stopped listening to everything else, because that's all we are really interested in. So I thought I'd take some heat from Peter right now, and they're not enough. I know that much. So how's that, Peter? This is really an important issue for county government. We are About 60% of our tax revenue that comes to county government comes from property tax. Unlike the state, which gets about 12% from property tax, and unlike the cities, they get about 20%. So when citizens passed Initiative 747 a number of years ago and capped property tax growth really at 1% of what we collected the previous year, it had a phenomenal different effect on county government and the revenue that we collect compared to other levels of government. The state that has business and occupation tax and significant more sales tax, cities has utility taxes, B&O taxes, and sales tax and property tax. We really are heavily property tax dependent. Historically, we were also very blessed if you had a U.S. Forest Service that cut trees, because we got 25% of most of the harvest came also to county government, largely to the road system, but also came to county roads. You can imagine what the impact was from the Northwest Spotted Owl, Northwest Forest Plan on county revenue. It was significant. It was significant. And I tell this story pretty routinely, and I probably am going to drift a little bit, but since I got the mic, that's all right. I was a county commissioner when the White Pass School District went from over 1,000 students to 300 students in a period of 3 years. And you want to talk about the devastation to a community, from mills closing, from unemployment, from people losing jobs, from families not knowing what they were going to do, to the families that could find new jobs left, not leaving an unemployment problem, but leaving us with the unemployable. And so it is a dramatic change when you see a reduction in revenue. So one of the reasons I'm passionate about keeping what forest industry alive is because I've seen what happens in a rural community, in rural communities across this state, when you actually do see the impact of reduction in timber harvest. So we have 2 or 3 major revenue sources out of the timber industry still. The first meaning is off of state lands that are held in trust. So we have trust lands that the Department of Natural Resources manages for, I think it's about 20 counties. And we generate, the DNR generates almost $60 million a year round average. It varies, but $60 million for those counties. And it goes across not only the county government, it goes to the junior taxing districts as well. And while we say this is urban or rural, it's actually Snohomish County is the #1 recipient of those resources. They have a major set of resources of DNR lands in Snohomish County. It is just not an urban-rural issue. Now, is it as important? Is $7.6 million as important in a Snohomish County budget as it is in a Skagit County budget? Probably not. But these are urban and rural dollars. The excise tax, or the forest excise tax that you referred to, the stumpage tax, however you want, whatever term you want to utilize, has been volatile. And you know that as much as we know that. From the recession years where we might have gotten only $16.4 million to some of the more glory years of it being $45 million. It is volatile depending on a lot of things, and clearly what's going on in the market is one of those. And so it's not a very stable and predictable revenue source in some regards for us as well. You saw, I think you pay about $8 million in property tax, I think is what you pay then as well, something like that. So these are really important services. In county government, you know, we oftentimes jokingly say we really perform 3 major functions. We are an agent for the state. Constitutionally, we run a set of services for the state of Washington that have to be really uniform. We conduct the elections on behalf of the state. We run the entire trial court system. So no one's in a state penitentiary unless they went through the county criminal justice system. We assess property tax. We collect property taxes. We do these core set of services that on behalf of the state of Washington, and they're done throughout the 39 counties. And so we need the resources and revenues to be able to do that. We are also your unincorporated government. When you call 911 in the unincorporated area, you're going to get a deputy sheriff out there. We're your unincorporated government as well. And then we do a variety of regional services for you as well. So those are all done pretty effectively. We tell the story that we are still about 10% fewer county employees in 2019 than we were in 2008 after the recession. We average about revenue growth of about 1 to 3% annually. The state of Washington, this last biennial budget is going to be a 19% increase. We wish we had, and I'm not even sure all our members wish, we simply don't have that type of revenue growth. So these are really important dollars, and I'm not going to say that they're not, but they go for really what considered to be those core governmental services that are out there.
Okay.
Now, can I keep going on other stuff?
No, that's good. Well, I guess I won't go there. Peter, to your credit, you have been at the forefront of many forest-related issues with an eye towards representing the environmentally inspired city folks who care very much about retaining our state's forest legacies. Care that sometimes comes close to the amount of care that each one in the audience cares about their individual forests. I couldn't avoid that little sarcasm there because we also care. Well, I made a reference about tree huggers earlier. We are the real original tree huggers. So, environmental folks clearly love forests and see our huge contribution to climate change mitigation. The disconnects are around how to manage. Regardless of the micro-regulatory debates, please share the long-term Conservation Caucus vision for forest land ownership or management in Washington State. Help us understand who these folks are and what motivates their interest in our forest land. If you were king for the day, how would you transform small forest landowner land or management? And you've already mentioned this, why do we always seem at odds when we have so much in common? We really do. And that's been part of my mantra ever since I've gotten involved in the public policy. It's just so frustrating. But that should give you plenty.
Well, so I'd like to reframe the question from why we care and whether we, urban, whatever you want to call us, people or environmentalists have a right to care, because I think we have a right to care, and we do care. And I'd like to reframe the question more to that fish and wildlife and clean water and plenty of it, and all the other carbon sequestration, all the good things like the growth management issues relating to keeping family forests intact, are important, are things we all care about and we all have a right to care about. And the real question isn't whether we have a right to care, whether we should care. The real question is what can we do working together on the landscape to keep the small forest landowners intact and to make this a viable long-term future for the state of Washington. That is what we should be working on, not whether some folks are ideologically different and don't care. You know, to your question a few minutes ago, you know, why do tree huggers, somebody said, why do tree huggers feel guilty when, you know, we cut the tree down, or why should we have to feel guilty? And you know, I would flip that around and say, well, why don't we feel guilty for buying wood furniture and buying those kinds of things? So we obviously do buy wood furniture and we don't feel guilty about it, so why should you feel guilty about taking the tree down? I think you are right. It does come down to the method and the license around doing it right and doing it sustainably and doing it consistent with, you know, the fish and the wildlife and all the other ecological services that come from forests. So, but look, I don't want to sugarcoat this. This is really a tough challenge, and I think that you know a lot of the reasons why it is tough. And what ultimately, the landscape as we see it, I don't think is news to you. We did a lot of, my colleague Cara Whitaker and I did a little work with Luke's data. And the numbers are staggeringly difficult to stay in forests and a small forest landowner ownership. And you know it better than I do, so I'm preaching to the choir. But the actual numbers are, and I was actually shocked to see this, but the market value per acre of small forest landowners is 26 times that of the industrial lands, and that's mostly because of the development potential to be down low, so to speak, close to where people are, close to the roads, you know, all those kinds of things. So it's huge, 26 times greater, and this is Luke's 2007 data. And the conversion risk that I believe Luke measured, if our numbers are right, we're something like 400 times greater for the small forest landowners than for the industrials, just because of that same factor. So the environmental community knows this. We get it. We really get it, that we just can't, that the odds are too stacked against the viability of small forest landowners. So we know that we have to help. We have to be there. It's good for the whole state for all the reasons that all of us have identified here today. But here's the rub, though. And we in the environmental community believe that we lose a lot of goodwill, a lot of our collaborative opportunity when we fight over regulations. We ultimately feel that given the massively difficult odds that are facing small forest landowner viability, to be fighting over 25, 50-foot buffers, those kinds of things, it detracts so much from the partnership, the collaboration that we need to go tackle those things. Ultimately, we don't think that a 50-foot narrower buffer is going to be able to surmount the odds of conversion. There are not enough good folks like the folks in this room to maintain it on the entire land base. So wouldn't it be great if we didn't sort of burn up all of our relationship fighting over 50 feet here, 25 feet here, rollbacks, or whatever, what have you. And in fact, we worked on things that would move the ball forward with on these things. And in addition, we don't think that the regulations would overcome things like the difficult generational issues managing small forest landowners. Thank God there are some folks here doing multi-generation work, but a lot of small forest landowners, kids want to go work for Microsoft or something like that, and and not have to go out in the family farm every weekend and start pulling competing vegetation. The lack of economies of scale, the developers walking around with suitcases of money and a very small land base over which to absorb the setbacks and the buffers, et cetera. So the odds are so stacked against small forest landowners, but that should be a call for unity and collaboration. It is not I am not here to preach pessimism. I'm here to say that we should be working together in Olympia to try to figure out what we can do to stay on, to keep the smalls on the landscape. And I don't know if I have enough. I don't know how much time you want me to. I mean, I've got a list of like 3 or 4 things that we could be working on that could make things work. And things like the whole the world of decarbonizing our world and offering carbon payments for responsible, sustainable, lighter impact forestry could be huge to get assistance. There should be a technical assistance for whether it be alternate plans which can be viable and which are viable. I'm regularly hearing stories about how successful alternate plans have been in, say, hardwood conversion scenarios where they've actually well paid for themselves. Whatever, I'm not a tax wonk, but whatever we're doing on the tax, we should take a look at our taxes and make sure that we incentivize folks to stay in the land, make it easy for them to stay in the land. I think that branding is another opportunity that's lost. All wood is good, but respectfully, we think some wood is better than others. And we don't brand our exemplary practices. That all goes into the same wood bin. And respectfully, I don't think that the care that some smalls would tend to their tree farm and the wood that comes out of it is necessarily the same as what might come out of some other, more industrialized lands. So I think that there's a difference of values that is unfortunately not respected by the marketplace. So there are a lot of ways with carbon, with water, ecosystem services, tax, technical assistance, alternative plans, a lot of these things where the environmental community could feel like we are not just fighting at the Forest Practices Board for year after year after year after year on those kinds of things, where we could just go in together and say, this is what we want to work on together to keep smalls in the land. That would be a great outcome, and I think all of my colleagues feel that way.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I will tell the audience that we did get conservation support for our bill. Name skips Paulus testified in favor of that bill. So that was a small step in the right direction. A lot of the things that you mentioned would be probably resolved if the legislature funded the programs that, you mentioned technical assistance. We got zero. Tammy got zero, so, and I take your point about the additional harvest values. That's not a big driver in conversion rates. It boils down to, in my mind, a little bit more about respect and appreciation, because we do believe that we can manage more aggressively in smaller stream reaches, smaller harvest units, and still protect the resources. That's where we get into these battles when it sounds like, well, you don't care about the resources, and that's not really the case. We're kind of arguing about the science, and we're not scientists, but so that's where we get kind of stuck. So one general question, I think, Peter, you've touched on some of this already, but maybe you might have a couple of additional thoughts. For all of those of us struggling to keep up with our motto of keeping our lands forested for generations to come, please share your thoughts on how we or you might help foster our long-term forest land stewardship. Some examples I tossed out in the questions I submitted might be more robust small business laws. If we'd had the small business economic impact statement, if there'd been some teeth in that, instead and then maybe that would have avoided some of the problems that we're having. Let's see, I think I had alternative viable ways that goes to regulations better managed with low impact prescriptions. Some examples. This was for Patrick. If they had small ag, and maybe some of you know about small ag, they face some of the same issues. Maybe there's some ideas from their experiences that might help us. How to rebuild the infrastructure. We talked about that missing on the east side. Voluntary transfer of development rights. Ben, you talked a little bit about that, and that's a tough nut to crack. Forterra has been working real hard on that. We just haven't found the cities willing to accept the buildup. I've said, while I was working with Forterra, if you could get the transfer development process working robustly where it was a market driven, so a speculator could come out and buy my development rights at a relatively low price and move those into the cities at a pretty high price. He would have a profit incentive to do that. I'd be happy, he'd be happy, and I would bet within 10 years you could buy up 80% of the development rights in the rural area, and you wouldn't affect the city populations by a small amount. But that's everything's political, right, Heather? That's a political. So anyway, I wandered on and on. Does anybody have any other thoughts about how we might help our social license, help keep small landowners on the land? We all want the same thing. It's just how we get there.
I just have one point about the TDRs, and I agree with you, Ken, that it should be the future. The problem is that the cities are upzoning everything to become more dense themselves. So the development rights don't have any value because the cities are providing more space for development to accept the millions of people we know are moving here. So that's the problem. I think there's been it's difficult monetizing those rights when they can buy them for free by just getting upzonings in the city. And so I don't know what the sort of if there's a statewide way to catalyze that program better. I don't know. I'm not an expert in it, but I know that that is been a real problem.
Yeah. Our biggest fear, of course, is that the Growth Management Act will get opened up again and they'll take them from us rather than monetize them. So there's a double-edged sword going on there that we have to worry about. Because as you mentioned very clearly, when we look at our net worth values, if we include the development value of the land that we own, that's a big chunk of our net worth.
And I just got to say one more thing. I mean, small forest landers are the only folks who complain about their land values going up.
And I can't resist giving one example. Bonnie let me buy a small parcel that was inside our holdings, and the county had that valued at $102,000, and I transferred that into designated forest land. So, that'll, I won't be able to use that without a big penalty, or my kids won't be able to use it. But that's just one level of dedication that the old people in the room anyway have to keeping forest land forested. It's the next generations that we're worried about.
I would say everyone complains about their assessed value until they sell their property. Then they want it very high. This is our experience at the county level. I think there's this interesting distinction between, and something that I think I would just that Ben, you really hit on, is that we have this responsibility at the county level to zone commercially significant forest lands. Most small forest landowners, I'm guessing, in taking back to my Lewis County, are not in those lands. They are in the rural landscape. They are in the area where there is development pressure from the 5, the 10s, the 20s, not the large lot, large 40s acre lots. And so there is a lot of development pressure. And I think that's one of the elements where we're asked to zone in a way that is illustrative of potentially protecting the land, and yet we aren't seeing some of the parallel public policies that are ultimately going to be what it takes to assure that that land stays what its intended use is, because it becomes an economic issue, not a zoning issue. And that's what I guess the state needs to really begin to think about, is how do we have parallel public policy, whether it's on the taxation side, whether it's on business and occupation tax, whether it's tax exemptions on property tax, which we're not necessarily always favorable of, but it is the fact that we should be thinking more about how do we align other public policy to support a zoning and regulatory scheme. When the state created the Office of Agricultural Land Preservation, I think that's the title of it. Heather, you might know. Office of Farmland Preservation, I think, is the current title of it. We took a very bizarre position, almost not in support of that as an association of counties, because we can zone land all you want to make it farmland, but unless it remains economically viable for someone to farm, it is not going to stay in farming. And that is an unfortunate reality, is what we've seen. So, I think we would work closely with you to find out other ways, because it makes our job a lot easier, that when we're zoning a piece of land for something that is not economically viable, I can tell you that is not a very fun public hearing to have when your fellow citizens are there, not very pleased with you. And I can tell you, zoning, my entire term as a county commissioner, the only time we had law enforcement in our room was during zoning, development regulation, Growth Management Act hearings. Emotions ran high when it comes to people's private property rights. Let's just say that. And if you want to talk, we didn't talk about the urban-rural divide. I don't know how we're talking about time.
Please.
That one's puzzled me. I kid with Peter quite a bit. We have a daughter that's saved the whaler, and I think whatever. I think I've driven her over the cliff. But it's a genuine question. It's playing out in our politics, and I don't understand. I really, honestly don't understand what's going on there. It's not just about politics. There's something organic going on there between rural and urban, and Francine, the gal that's going to help us with the reinvigoration of TFW policy. I asked her that similar question, and she said that's not unique to Washington or the U.S. It's around the world, that the rural people are kind of feeling left out and disrespected. So.
Yeah, or not valued. I think a couple of different things. So we talk about it as being urban versus rural, and I want to make sure people realize that urban versus rural happens in every single community. When I was the Lewis County Commissioner, Centralia Chehalis was urban, and Packwood and PL looked in at the city and said, "Oh my God, everything's going to the I-5 corridor." If you're in, if you're in King County, Snohomish County, Pierce County, they have viable rural economies. They have rural portions of their county. They have timber. They have agriculture in those portions of the county. There's movements to have Cascade County and Freedom County carved out of those urban counties because they, it's just not an east-west divide or an urban-rural divide. It's within individual areas as well. And I would just portray, I actually did a presentation to the Recreation Conservation Office Board a couple of years ago about kind of why people don't want public land ownership, or why are rural counties tired of seeing public land ownership. And there's just, you don't have to go very far to just go back and think about the difference between John Muir and Gifford Pinchot and the different values of what our lands would be for. This is not anything that is radically new or has emerged. It's just something that, I think we have a unique opportunity here in Washington State, which is to sit at the table, and it's going to be time consuming, it's going to be painstaking to hear what's the value of each of us and how do we build a collaborative solution. We did that with the voluntary stewardship program for agriculture. The ag community is very much fearful that they will at some point have an ag, fish, and wildlife agreement, and they will have
I
gotta say it again. Big, fat, dumb buffers is what they keep telling Maya.
They're fearful that they'll have agricultural practice rules, similar to forest practices rules, and that's the last thing that they want. It took 4 years to negotiate an agreement on a voluntary stewardship program, but it has a monitoring scheme that's going to force the agriculture community to prove that they in fact can be the good stewards of the land, that water quality is not going backwards, and that they are creating the type of protections necessary to the environment. So I think there's lots of opportunities for us to have those conversations. They are not new. The distinction between urban and rural, the distinction between different values of what should we do with the land from conserving it and multiple use perspective or preserving it is not a new conflict. And I think we just have to find ways here in Washington State to be very productive to have those conversations so we can come to the agreements we can come to.
Ben, any closing comments?
So as Eric was speaking, I was thinking about counties and the challenges they face in terms of, going through a zoning exercise and the need for revenue and how different zoning affects county revenue and that sort of thing. And so it's definitely a challenge. One of the things that I'm going to be working on in the next few years is working on guidance for counties in terms of resource land designation. And for me, it's helpful to come and learn because, how small forest landowners are being affected by different decisions that are made at the county level, including your lands into a designated resource land area or not, and what kind of development pressures it places on them. And I think the counties may be able to do a better job when they're going through their review of their designations about what's necessary to support that industry in their county, and then talking to neighboring counties about, where are these land uses in your county, and is there a way to cooperate more regionally? Going back to transfer of development rights, I think taking a more regional approach makes more sense there too, and I don't, outside of the four-county area, King, Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap, I don't think that's necessarily happening. Because a lot of times you've got the rural lands and they may not have a large city to transfer those rights to. It's a problem that Peter was talking about where they keep upzoning, so there's no value in transferring those credits. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there to help preserve forest lands going forward.
As a planning person, I can't help bring up an example that used to be in Thurston County because I was on the county advisory board, and we would see these large lot developments, or I forget what they called them, but basically what we had in Thurston County at that time was cluster developments. So if you had a piece of property that, based on zoning, had 10 development rights, the county would let you build 12 houses if you put them in a concentrated portion of that, and then forever dedicate the rest of that property as resource property. And I thought that was a really wonderful way to kind of backdoor permanently set aside a lot of, either farm or forestry lands, and but that didn't fit with the Growth Management Act. There was a lawsuit, and they ended up having to kill that whole program. Peter, any final thoughts?
Well, I'm a lawyer and not a sociologist, but I'm intrigued. Ken and I have spoken a lot about the urban and rural sort of dichotomy, and I honestly do think that's a false choice. But I do understand why it happens, and there are reasons it happens. First of all, let's face it, it is regularly politicized by folks who are trying to get political advantage on separating interests. So it doesn't help that the difficulties we have living in cities near rural areas are being politicized. That doesn't help. The fact of the matter is that we do need each other, which is one of the reasons the state of Washington is so great. We need wood from Lewis County, and when, God forbid, children get sick, they need Children's Hospital in Seattle. We need each other. We can't be each other, but we need each other, and we have to go about managing our landscape that way. Urban people really misunderstand forestry in a lot of ways, and some of it is excusable and some of it isn't. On the one hand, urban people see heavily industrialized landscapes from their airplane, on their way across the Snoqualmie Pass, on their, just driving to the Oregon coast, whatever. They see industrial landscapes, and it doesn't look right to them. It looks denuded. It looks mistreated. They don't understand it. So there's an aesthetic reaction. And I'm not saying it's right or fair, but it's just the truth. A lot of folks see it and just don't get it. And so they see that a lot of folks have lost their connection to the landscape. They don't get out themselves, and they either think life is a national park or it's the city, and there's nothing in between, and they don't understand the difference between property ownerships and boundary, federal, state, private, and all the host of different issues. And then there are a lot of folks who, and this is not easy, but there are a lot of folks like me who say, 90% of the old growth is gone. When Forest and Fish was enacted, the numbers right out of the EIS was that 60 to 70% of the riparian areas were in early cereal stage throughout the state. We've cut a lot of the salmon, the stuff that we need to have good salmon habitat out there was cut. The urban and agricultural have done just as much damage. I'm not saying this is all forestry at all. Please don't take that as that. But there have been extinctions. There are, it is our sort of heritage to have the evergreen state. And so these are not fair things. They're not fair to small forest landowners, but it's not also fair to sort of characterize it as an urban-rural divide, because there are a lot of people who, if they understood more, and would, if they had an opportunity to vote on win-win things that keep the landscape working, that provide products for society, that provide ecosystem services, they care about that. They would want to see that.
I think if we could somehow or another get our Luncheon Awards deal right in the middle of Seattle somehow, so everybody in Seattle could see all the cool things that family forest owners do, I think that a lot of that divide would go away. Please thank our panel.